Nowhere is the threat of antibiotic-resistant bacteria more urgent than in hospitals, with their heavy reliance on antibiotics and their population of vulnerable patients. There have been problems in hospitals around the country, and over the past decade, hospitals in the New York City area have become the epicenter of a particularly resistant and deadly superbug. It's called KPC. It lives in the digestive system and can spread its resistance to other bacteria. And patients who get it in one hospital can carry the bacteria to other hospitals. That happened in a story we first told in 2013, when one of the nation's most prestigious hospitals, the Clinical Center at the National Institutes of Health, found itself battling a major KPC outbreak. It began in the summer of 2011, when a patient with a rare lung disease was transferred from a New York City hospital to be treated at the NIH in Bethesda, Maryland. She was carrying KPC. It was the first case of it the NIH had ever seen.
We immediately went on high alert, the equivalent of hospital epidemiology DEFCON 5, tried to implement as many things as we could think of at the time to prevent any further spread of the organism in the hospital.
The patient was placed in what we call enhanced contact isolation, which means everybody who went in the room, including visitors, had to wear gloves and gowns.
But this was the intensive care unit, where patients are very sick and highly vulnerable.
Check your blood sugar, okay?
It's the kind of place where the bacteria can spread with ease. People are very busy, and there are a lot of things going on. Patients get very sick very quickly and require intervention. The bacteria can be spread on the hands. They can be spread on pieces of equipment that might go from patient to patient, so you have to be really cautious.
Their efforts to contain KPC appeared to work. When other ICU patients were tested for KPC,
we found nothing. So at that point, we thought that there had not been spread of the bacteria.
the New York patient ultimately recovered and was discharged after 4 weeks in the hospital.
We really felt like we had dodged a bullet.
But then, a big surprise.
5 weeks later, unexpectedly,
Could you do me a favor? Could you get me just a tube fixator for out of the RT closet?
a KPC bacteria turned up in a respiratory culture.
And with it, a mystery.
How this could have spread from the first patient to the second patient.
They were not in the ICU at the same time. They didn't have the same caregivers. They didn't have the same equipment. So initially we thought it might be possible that this was a second introduction of yet another KPC organism.
I was extremely concerned because the infections with these bacteria had a high mortality rate.
As they began to investigate, searching for KPC on equipment and testing the patients yet again, they realized the problem was much bigger.
We started finding other patients in the intensive care unit to whom the bacteria had spread.
They had an outbreak. The KPC was spreading. The patients were getting sicker. And antibiotics weren't working.
And we tried combinations of 5, 6 antibiotics. We tried making oral antibiotics into intravenous antibiotics. We even got an investigational antibiotic from a pharmaceutical company.
An experimental one, a test one.
An experimental antibiotic, and that also did not work.
Desperate to contain the outbreak, the hospital took unprecedented steps. They created a separate ICU for KPC patients, brought in robots to disinfect empty rooms.
Had monitors here reminding us to wash our hands, built a whole wall up in the other side. We moved every patient in the ICU, completely cleaned it, moved patients back in. And no matter what we did, the bacteria was still spreading.
We didn't know what was going on.
With the hospital in crisis, genetic researchers in Building 49 next door were scrambling to figure out how the KPC was spreading.
We had now gotten to the point where
They were identifying a patient a week, and it was not clear how these patients might be related to each other.
This bacteria has the capacity to live
By
in the
comparing the
stomach
DNA in the KPC samples, the researchers made an alarming discovery. Silent carriers, people who were carrying the bacteria but showing no signs of infection, were spreading the KPC. As they urgently searched for silent carriers throughout the rest of the hospital, their worst nightmare came true. The outbreak had spread beyond the ICU.
That's a very scary moment. Suddenly, it's in the general patient population.
The staff was in a panic. As they looked on helplessly, patients began to die. There were few options left.
Dr. Gallen asked me if we needed to close the hospital or if we needed to close the hospital to admissions. Ultimately, we decided not to close the hospital, but
It was a possibility.
absolutely.
Instead, they expanded testing hospital-wide and isolated all those found with KPC. Finally, 6 months after patient 1 first arrived, the outbreak appeared to have ended almost as suddenly as it had begun.
We started to be a little more optimistic. And we continued all of our aggressive measures to control the bacteria in the hospital.
But by then, 18 patients had been infected with KPC, and 6 people had died from it. No patients or their families ever came forward to talk about their experience. But after seeing our story, one family did. Not long after the scare at the NIH subsided, in Wilmer, Minnesota, 19-year-old Troy Stulin was recovering from a bone marrow transplant he'd received at NIH months earlier.
It went very well. He started recovering, and then one morning he woke up and he had blisters all over his body. We called the doctors at the NIH, and they were concerned that maybe he would get infection in these blisters, so they wanted him to come back out there again.
It was a huge relief to be back there again. I thought of it as being one of the, best of the best hospitals in the nation, and I felt very comfortable being there. When we got there, he was in a lot of pain, and so they finally gave him some medicine for the pain. But, we're just thinking, okay, this is just 10 days, short term. They'll get this figured out, and then we'll go back home again, not a big deal.
Troy had suffered health problems from birth. The most serious was a genetic disorder called chronic granulomatous disease. As he reached his teens, Troy's illness was causing serious gastrointestinal problems, and his doctors recommended he undergo a difficult and risky bone marrow transplant at NIH.
And Troy was totally on board about it. He said, if I have the transplant and I'm cured, I win because I'm healthy and I'm normal. If I die, I win because I go to heaven.
Troy's transplant actually took place at NIH during the KPC outbreak, but he was on another floor and unaffected by it. Now that he was back, his weakened state left him dangerously susceptible to infections. As the days turned into months, his complications worsened.
As the months progressed, they just couldn't figure out what to do with his skin. He was in ICU probably 4 or 5 times.
It was kind of a balancing act that whole time, how to properly treat him. Whether he needed platelets, whether he needed blood, whether he needed more steroids.
Basically, it got to the point it was like, okay, what's next? What's the next bad thing that's going to happen?
Then, in August 2012, the doctors brought some shocking news. Troy tested positive for KPC. It was 8 months after the hospital thought the outbreak was over.
When the bacteria came back, did it surprise you?
That more than surprised me. That was devastating. It sort of brought back all of the emotions of the fall, a feeling as though we finally have this situation under control, and then a new patient being identified.
I remember the doctor coming in and saying, we discovered Troy has KPC, and said we're going to move him across the hall to the isolation unit. I kind of Googled it and stuff like that, and learning that, hey, this is a pretty serious infection. This is one of those superbugs.
Marilyn just said, I'm really scared about this infection.
He has a low immune system. We're in a hospital. Yeah, it was very scary. It's like, we've got a lot of things going against us here. But he was doing okay with it, and I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe he'll be fine.
He had acquired other infections along the way, but they always had antibiotics that were used, and he was able to get through those infections.
At first, Troy was put on a powerful but toxic antibiotic called colistin, and it appeared to be working.
He was testing negative for the infection, and his kidney was working. It seemed like things were heading in the right direction. I was actually heading back home again, and literally a half hour before I left the hospital, the chaplain and the nurse came and asked Marilyn and I if they could meet with us. They just said, you need to start preparing to talk to your son about dying, a possibility of dying. They said, we've seen this infection before, and it doesn't always end well. Sure enough, a few days later, the doctor said that the infection has mutated and that the colistin is no longer being effective. It wasn't long after that his vital signs started to fail. They had exhausted all options, and there was nothing more they could do. All they could do was keep him comfortable at that point.
On September 7th, 2012, the family gathered in Troy's room in the ICU.
It was a long day.
It's very hard to watch your son daily starting to lose his life, and then to see him on a ventilator and not be able to do a thing about it. It's really hard.
We were able to all be together for the last couple hours, and Troy passed away that evening about 7:45.
The doctors said a KPC patient from the earlier outbreak had probably brought the superbug back to the hospital during a routine follow-up. But they were unsure how Troy had come in contact with it. He was the last victim of the KPC outbreak.
Do you think KPC is now gone from your hospital?
Oh, no, absolutely not. I think that we have to be extremely vigilant in the coming years. The rate of these infections has risen sharply during the past decade.
Hospitals are generally not required to report details of outbreaks like this one to the public, but the researchers at NIH believe the lessons are important and must be shared.
Talking about hospital infections is really difficult for a hospital because we all know that when you come to the hospital, there are certain risks, but we've now laid bare what are those risks. We owe it to those patients to honor those patients by ensuring that this does not happen in another hospital.
If I had a major message, it would be that it's never going to end. This organism and organisms like this are going to be with us. We have to develop new strategies for managing them. We have to change our culture in the hospital.
The surprise to me was that he didn't die from the bone marrow transplant, which is what, if there was going to be a problem, we thought it would be tied to the bone marrow transplant. We never thought that it would be an infection that couldn't be cured.
this and other Frontline programs, visit our website at pbs.org/frontline. Frontline's The Trouble with Antibiotics is available on DVD. To order, visit shoppbs.org or call 1-800-PLAY-PBS. Frontline is also available for download on iTunes.